The strangest thing about the boy was not that he had survived the war. It was that, at 13 years old, he had almost forgotten what comfort felt like. Germany, July 1945. Summer had returned to the countryside, but it felt different now. The fields beyond the village were green again, wildflowers pushed through cracks in old stone walls, and swallows circled beneath a pale blue sky. From a distance, everything looked peaceful. But up close, the signs of hardship remained everywhere. Roof tiles were missing. Windows were patched with scrap wood. Long lines formed outside aid stations before sunrise. People spoke softly, moved carefully, and learned not to expect too much from tomorrow. Hans Keller was 13 years old. He lived with his mother in what had once been the basement of a small apartment building. The upper floors still stood, but nobody trusted them. Rain leaked through damaged ceilings. Wind slipped through broken frames during cool nights. So they stayed below ground where it was dry enough and safe enough. Safe enough had become the standard for everything. Every morning, Hans woke before daylight. Not because he wanted to, but because years of uncertainty had trained his body to do so. He folded his blanket neatly, put on the same faded shirt he wore almost every day, and stepped outside into the cool morning air. The village smelled faintly of damp earth, chimney smoke, and fresh cut wood. People were rebuilding whatever they could. Piece by piece. Board by board. Hope by hope. Hans rarely spoke. The adults noticed it. The other children noticed it too. While they chased each other through open fields and played games beside the creek, Hans usually sat alone. Sometimes he watched clouds drift overhead. Sometimes he stared toward the road leading west, where American trucks occasionally passed through town. Nobody knew exactly what he was thinking. Perhaps not even Hans himself. There was simply a heaviness inside him that had settled there long ago. The kind that did not disappear just because the fighting had ended. His clothes were always clean, at least as clean as circumstances allowed. His mother worked hard to keep them that way. But there was something else people noticed. Hans always seemed cold. Even on warm afternoons. He crossed his arms when he walked. He tucked his hands into his sleeves whenever a breeze appeared. At night, while others slept beneath open windows, he wrapped himself tightly in blankets. Comfort had become unfamiliar. Warmth felt temporary. The village well stood near the center square. Every few days, Hans carried buckets back home. The water was cold year-round. In winter it felt like melted ice. In summer it was merely less cruel. That was what bathing meant now. A basin. A rag. Cold water. Quick movements. No complaints. Nobody expected more. One evening, as the golden light of sunset settled across the rooftops, Hans sat alone on a wooden fence overlooking a narrow dirt road. Dust drifted through the air. Crickets had begun their evening song. Somewhere nearby, someone played a harmonica softly from an open window. The melody floated through the warm summer air and disappeared into the gathering dusk. Hans listened quietly. Then he lowered his head and stared at his hands. They looked older than they should have. Rough. Weathered. Like the hands of someone twice his age. Yet beneath the dust, beneath the silence, beneath the habits learned through difficult years, there was still a boy waiting to be found. A boy who had forgotten many things. Forgotten ease. Forgotten certainty. Forgotten what it felt like to simply be a child. And in just a few days, something as ordinary as warm water would remind him. 3 days later, the village woke beneath a sky the color of polished silver. Low clouds drifted overhead, soft and heavy, promising rain that never seemed to arrive. Hans stood near the well with 2 metal buckets resting beside his feet. The morning air carried the scent of wet grass and fresh lumber. Somewhere nearby, a hammer struck wood in a slow, steady rhythm. Rebuilding had become the soundtrack of daily life. People repaired roofs, cleared debris, painted doors. The work never seemed to end. Hans lowered the bucket into the well and listened to the splash far below. The rope creaked against the wooden frame as he pulled the weight back toward the surface. His arms strained slightly. At 13, He was taller than many boys his age, but months of shortages had left him lean and narrow. He balanced the buckets carefully and began the walk home. The dirt road curved through the center of town before passing a small church whose bell had remained silent for years. Wildflowers now grew beside the stone walls. Bright yellow, deep blue, colors that seemed almost too cheerful after everything the village had endured. As Hans rounded the corner near the church, he noticed something unusual. 2 American trucks stood parked beside an empty warehouse at the edge of town. Men moved in and out carrying crates, lumber, and supplies. Villagers watched from a distance. Some were curious. Others remained cautious. Old fears did not disappear overnight. Hans slowed his pace. The warehouse had been abandoned for years. Its windows had once been covered with dust and broken glass. Now workers were cleaning the building. New boards leaned against the walls. Fresh paint sat stacked near the entrance. The place looked alive again. He watched for a moment before continuing home. By afternoon, word had spread through the village. The Americans were opening a community relief center. Nobody seemed entirely sure what that meant. Some said it would distribute food. Others claimed it would provide medical care. A few insisted it was simply another government office. The rumors changed every hour. Hans listened quietly while adults discussed it outside the bakery. He never joined the conversation. He rarely did. The next morning, activity around the warehouse increased. Trucks arrived carrying more supplies. Children gathered nearby, unable to contain their curiosity. They peered through windows and whispered to one another. Hans stayed across the street. Watching. Waiting. There was one American he noticed more than the others. A tall man in his late 20s with light brown hair and a calm expression. His uniform was neat but worn from long months of service. Unlike some of the soldiers who moved quickly from task to task, this man often stopped to speak with villagers. He listened more than he talked. Sometimes he helped carry boxes. Sometimes he swept floors. Once, Hans even saw him kneeling beside an elderly woman, repairing a broken wheel on her handcart. His name, according to the people nearby, was Sergeant Thomas Walker. Hans heard the name several times over the next few days. It became part of the background noise of the village. Sergeant Walker fixed the generator. Sergeant Walker helped unload supplies. Sergeant Walker found medicine for Mrs. Becker. The stories traveled from doorstep to doorstep. Yet Hans kept his distance. He had learned long ago that trusting strangers often led to disappointment. One warm afternoon, he sat beneath an oak tree overlooking the road near the relief center. Sunlight filtered through the leaves above him, painting shifting patterns across the ground. Cicadas buzzed in the branches. The air felt thick and still. Children laughed somewhere in the distance. Hans watched people enter and leave the warehouse. Families. Elderly couples. Young mothers carrying babies. Everyone seemed to emerge carrying something useful. A loaf of bread. A blanket. A small box of supplies. Near the entrance, Sergeant Walker stood speaking with villagers. His posture was relaxed. His voice was calm. He smiled often. Not the forced smile of someone trying to impress others. A genuine smile. The kind that reached the eyes. At one point, Walker glanced toward the oak tree. His gaze settled briefly on Hans. Just for a second. Then he nodded politely and returned to his conversation. Hans immediately looked away. Yet something about the exchange stayed with him. There had been no suspicion in the man's eyes. No judgment. No expectation. Just a simple acknowledgement. As if Hans were not invisible. As if he mattered. The thought unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Late that evening, as the sun disappeared behind distant rooftops, a thin stream of pale vapor drifted upward from behind the relief center. Hans noticed it immediately. It rose into the cooling air like a ghostly ribbon. Soft. White. Constant. He stared at it from across the street. Nobody else seemed to pay attention. But Hans could not stop looking. Because for the first time in years, he was seeing. something he almost no longer recognized. Steam. The next morning, Hans returned to the road across from the relief center before most of the village was awake. A light fog rested over the fields, turning the distant trees into soft gray silhouettes. Dew covered the grass. Every step darkened the cuffs of his trousers. He told himself he was only passing by on his way to the well. Only curious. Nothing more. Yet when he reached the corner overlooking the warehouse, he stopped. The thin ribbon of steam was there again, rising steadily behind the building, white against the cool morning air. It drifted upward, curled gently, then vanished into the pale sky. Hans stood motionless. He could not remember the last time he had seen steam like that. Not from a kettle. Not from a pot. Real steam. The kind that came from abundant hot water. The kind people once took for granted. Throughout the morning, he found himself thinking about it. While carrying buckets. While helping his mother stack firewood. While eating a simple lunch of bread and potatoes. The image kept returning. The white cloud. The warmth it seemed to promise. By afternoon, curiosity won. He walked back toward the relief center. Children played near the entrance. Women carried supply boxes toward waiting carts. A carpenter hammered new shelves together beneath an open window. The entire building seemed alive with purpose. Hans remained near the edge of the yard, watching from a distance. Then he saw Sergeant Walker emerge from a side door carrying a crate. The American set it down beside a truck and wiped sweat from his forehead. Summer sunlight reflected from the metal frames of nearby windows. For a moment, Walker glanced toward the road. He spotted Hans immediately. The boy considered leaving. Instead, he stayed where he was. Walker did not approach right away. He simply nodded once, the same polite acknowledgement he had given before. Then he returned to work. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. Hans lingered beneath the shade of a maple tree. Eventually Walker crossed the yard carrying an empty clipboard. He stopped several feet away. Close enough to speak. Far enough not to crowd him. "You have been watching this place for days," he said with a faint smile. His German was imperfect but understandable. Hans looked down at the ground. "Maybe." Walker glanced toward the rear of the building where the steam continued rising above the roofline. "That what interests you?" Hans followed his gaze. For a second neither spoke. Finally he nodded. "What is it?" Walker seemed surprised by the question. Then he laughed softly. Not at Hans. Simply from realizing how unusual the answer might sound. "A shower building," he said. "We converted part of the warehouse." Hans blinked. "A shower?" "Several of them." Walker pointed toward the rear entrance. "Hot water, too." The words settled into the air between them. Hot water. Hans lowered his eyes. He was not sure why his chest suddenly felt tight. Walker noticed the reaction. "You have used one before?" Hans hesitated. Then he answered honestly. "A long time ago." The American nodded slowly. No questions. No pressure. Just understanding. Nearby, a truck engine rumbled to life. Workers loaded supplies. Someone called out from across the yard. The ordinary sounds of daily life continued around them. "You know," Walker said after a moment, "the showers are for everyone." Hans remained silent. "If you want to use one." Still no response. Walker rested the clipboard against his side. "You do not have to decide today." Then he turned as if preparing to leave. After a few steps he paused. "But if you ever do," he added, "the water is yours." Hans watched him walk away. Such a simple sentence. Yet it followed him all the way home. That evening, he sat outside the basement entrance while shadows stretched across the village. The air smelled of cut grass and wood smoke. A gentle breeze rustled leaves overhead. Beyond the rooftops, the last light of day faded into gold and amber. He found himself staring once more toward the relief center. The steam was visible even from here. Quiet. Steady. Waiting. And for the first time in years, Hans felt something unfamiliar stirring beneath the weight he carried every day. Anticipation. The following afternoon arrived warmer than the day before. Sunlight poured across the village square and settled on the rooftops like liquid gold. The air smelled of fresh-cut pine from a nearby repair crew, mixed with the faint scent of bread drifting from the bakery. Hans spent the morning helping his mother organize supplies they had received from the relief center. Neither of them mentioned the shower building. Neither of them mentioned the steam. Yet the thought remained in his mind from the moment he woke. By early afternoon, he found himself walking toward the warehouse once again. This time his steps felt slower, more deliberate. The gravel crunched beneath his shoes. A wagon rolled past carrying lumber. Children raced through a field chasing a homemade ball. Life seemed louder than usual. Perhaps because Hans noticed it more. When he reached the relief center, he stopped near the entrance and looked toward the rear of the building. The steam was there again, rising steadily into the summer sky. For several moments, he simply stood watching. Then he heard a familiar voice. "Good afternoon, Hans." He turned. Sergeant Walker stood beside a stack of wooden crates. The American held a clipboard under one arm and a pencil behind his ear. His expression remained calm, exactly as it always seemed to be. Hans nodded. "Good afternoon." Walker glanced toward the rear of the building. "Still curious?" Hans hesitated before answering. "Maybe." The faintest smile appeared on the sergeant's face. "That is usually how it starts." Neither laughed. Yet the tension between them eased slightly. Walker set the clipboard down and motioned toward a side path leading behind the warehouse. "Come on." Hans looked uncertain. "You do not have to use it," Walker said. "Just see it." The boy followed several steps behind as they walked around the building. The sounds of the village gradually faded. Hammering became distant. Voices softened. Then they reached a small addition attached to the warehouse. The structure was simple. Fresh boards. New windows. A narrow chimney extending above the roof. Steam drifted from a vent near the top. Hans stared at it. Up close, it seemed almost alive. The side door stood open. Warm air spilled gently into the afternoon sunlight. Walker stopped beside the entrance. "This is it." Hans remained outside. He could feel the warmth from several feet away. Not overwhelming. Just steady. Comfortable. Through the doorway he could see clean tile floors. White walls. Metal pipes running neatly along the ceiling. Everything looked impossibly bright. Impossibly clean. Walker noticed the boy's hesitation. "Nobody is inside right now." Hans took a cautious step forward. Then another. The moment he crossed the doorway, he froze. The air felt completely different. Warmer. Softer. It wrapped around him like a blanket fresh from the sun. He had not expected that. The room smelled faintly of soap. Clean soap. The kind he barely remembered. Sunlight streamed through small windows and reflected from polished metal fixtures mounted along the walls. Hans stared at them. Row after row of shower heads. Silver. Shining. Silent. For a moment he forgot to breathe. Walker did not interrupt. He simply waited. Hans walked farther into the room. His footsteps echoed softly against the tile floor. Every surface seemed spotless. Every detail seemed impossible. He reached out and touched one of the metal pipes. It felt warm beneath his fingertips. Not hot. Just warm. Real. His hand remained there longer than necessary. Walker watched quietly. "The boiler is behind that wall," he explained. "Keeps water flowing all day." Hans nodded but barely heard him. His attention had drifted elsewhere. To memories. A different house. A different life. A small bathroom from years ago. A towel hanging beside a window. His father humming while shaving. The distant sound of his mother preparing breakfast. Ordinary moments. Forgotten moments. Moments that suddenly felt close enough to touch. The room remained silent except for the faint hum of water moving through hidden pipes. Hans stood in the middle of the shower building and realized something strange. For the first time in years, he was standing somewhere that felt untouched by hardship, untouched by worry, untouched by survival. It was only a room. Tile. Pipes. Water. Yet somehow it felt like a doorway leading back to a world he thought had disappeared forever. Walker stepped toward one of the shower stations and rested his hand on a metal valve. The room remained quiet except for the faint hum coming from somewhere behind the walls. Hans watched carefully. Every movement seemed important. Every sound seemed amplified. The American looked at him once, almost asking permission without words. Hans gave a small nod. Walker slowly turned the valve. At first there was only a distant rush deep inside the pipes. Then came a low vibration. Water moving. Traveling. Approaching. A second later, a stream poured from the shower head above. Clear. Steady. Continuous. Hans stared at it. The water struck the tile floor with a soft rhythmic sound unlike anything he had heard in years. Not rain. Not a leaking pipe. Not water drawn from a bucket. This was different. Effortless. Endless. Steam began rising almost immediately. Thin at first. Then thicker. It curled through the air in pale ribbons and drifted toward the ceiling. Hans stepped closer. His eyes never left the stream. Walker did not speak. He simply let the moment happen. The boy extended one hand cautiously. Slowly. Almost nervously. His fingertips entered the flow. Instantly he pulled back. Not from pain. From surprise. Genuine surprise. He looked at his hand. Then at the water. Then back at his hand again. Warm. Real warmth. Not imagined. Not remembered. Present. He reached forward a second time. This time he kept his hand beneath the stream. His shoulders relaxed slightly. The tension he carried seemed to loosen by a fraction. Warm water flowed across his skin and disappeared down the drain. Such an ordinary thing. Yet Hans stood completely still. The sensation felt almost impossible. The room around him faded. The polished tiles faded. The warehouse faded. Even Sergeant Walker seemed distant for a moment. In their place came fragments of memory. A winter morning years earlier. Frost on a window. His mother folding towels beside a stove. His father laughing at something he could no longer remember. A warm house. A normal life. Before uncertainty became permanent. Before comfort became rare. Hans blinked several times. The memories arrived without warning. Small pieces. Small flashes. Yet each one felt precious. Walker quietly stepped toward a shelf along the wall and placed a clean towel nearby. Then he moved back toward the doorway. "Take your time," he said gently. "There is no hurry." Hans looked toward him. "Nobody else is waiting?" Walker shook his head. "Not today." The American gave a small smile and stepped outside, leaving the door partially open. Hans remained alone. The steady sound of falling water filled the room. He listened to it. Not just with his ears. With something deeper. The sound carried a strange sense of peace. Predictable. Reliable. Constant. For years, almost nothing in his life had felt constant. He moved closer again and held both hands beneath the stream. Warmth spread through his fingers. Across his palms. Into his wrists. His eyes closed briefly. The simple sensation seemed to travel far beyond his skin. Into memories. Into emotions he rarely allowed himself to feel. Outside, a distant church bell marked the passing hour. Somewhere in the village, children laughed. A wagon rattled over loose stones. Life continued beyond the walls. Yet inside the shower building, time felt slower. Softer. Hans opened his eyes and looked once more at the water flowing endlessly from the shower head. He realized something that surprised him. For the first time in years, he was not thinking about tomorrow. He was not thinking about shortages. He was not thinking about loss. He was simply standing there. Feeling warmth. feeling present, feeling 13 years old again. And as the steam continued rising around him, he made a quiet decision. Tomorrow, he would come back. Not just to look. Not just to wonder. Tomorrow, he would finally step beneath the water. The next morning, Hans woke before sunrise. For several seconds he lay still beneath his blanket, listening to the familiar sounds of the basement room. The soft creak of old wood overhead. The distant chirping of birds outside. The quiet breathing of his mother on the other side of the room. Usually mornings felt the same. Predictable. Heavy. But this morning felt different. A thought waited for him the moment he opened his eyes. Warm water. He dressed quickly and stepped outside into the cool dawn air. The village was just beginning to wake. A thin layer of mist hovered above the fields beyond town. The sky glowed pale orange along the horizon. Hans helped his mother gather water from the well. He stacked firewood beside the basement entrance. He completed every task expected of him. Yet throughout the morning, his attention drifted toward the relief center. Toward the small building behind the warehouse. Toward the promise waiting there. By late morning, sunlight filled the streets. The mist had vanished. Summer warmth settled across the village. Hans finally made his way toward the relief center. His heart beat slightly faster with every step. Not from fear exactly. Something closer to nervous excitement. The feeling seemed unfamiliar after so many years. When he reached the warehouse, Sergeant Walker was unloading supplies from a truck. The American spotted him immediately. He smiled but said nothing. No questions. No pressure. Just a simple nod. Hans nodded back. Then he continued walking toward the shower building. The door stood open. Warm air drifted outward. The same scent of soap lingered inside. Clean. Fresh. Welcoming. Hans stepped into the changing area carrying a folded towel Walker had left for him earlier that morning. The room was empty. Quiet. Sunlight streamed through high windows and painted bright rectangles across the floor. For several moments he simply stood there. Listening. Somewhere behind the walls, water moved through pipes with a low steady hum. He took a deep breath. Then another. Slowly he prepared himself. The process felt strangely important. Almost ceremonial. Not because it was complicated. Because it had been absent from his life for so long. A few minutes later, he stood alone beneath one of the shower heads. The tile felt cool beneath his feet. Steam drifted softly through the room. Hans stared upward at the polished metal fixture. For a moment he hesitated. Then he reached toward the valve. His fingers wrapped around it carefully. He turned it. Water rushed through the pipes. A second later, a warm stream descended from above. Hans froze. The water touched his shoulders first. Then his arms. Then the top of his head. His eyes closed instantly. A long breath escaped his lungs. Warmth spread across his skin in gentle waves. Not harsh. Not overwhelming. Perfect. He remained motionless. The steady sound surrounded him. Water. Steam. Silence. Everything else disappeared. The village disappeared. The shortages disappeared. The years of uncertainty disappeared. Only the warmth remained. Minutes passed. Hans could not have said how many. Time seemed different inside the room. Slower. Softer. He lifted his face toward the water and allowed it to flow freely. The sensation awakened memories he had forgotten existed. Summer evenings before the war. Family meals. Clean towels warming beside a stove. Laughter drifting from another room. Ordinary moments. Precious moments. For years those memories had remained hidden beneath worry and survival. Now they surfaced one after another. Not painful. Not sad. Simply alive again. Outside, life continued as usual. Wagons rolled through town. Workers repaired buildings. Children played in dusty streets. Inside the shower building, Hans stood beneath the warm stream and felt something he had not felt in a very long time. Safe. completely safe. The realization arrived quietly. Without warning. Without drama. It settled into his chest and remained there. He opened his eyes and looked through the rising steam. For the first time since he could remember, the future did not seem frightening. It simply seemed possible. When Hans finally opened his eyes again, the light coming through the high windows had shifted. The bright morning sun now angled across the tiles in long golden bands. Dustless steam drifted through the beams like pale clouds floating indoors. He blinked several times, trying to understand why the room looked different. Then he realized time had passed. Far more time than he expected. Yet he felt no urgency to leave. The water continued falling in a steady stream. Warm. Constant. Reliable. The simple rhythm seemed to quiet every anxious thought that usually occupied his mind. He sat down on a nearby bench wrapped in a towel for a few minutes, then returned beneath the water again. Not because he needed to. Because he could. The realization felt extraordinary. For years, nearly everything in life had been measured. Food was measured. Firewood was measured. Water was measured. Every comfort carried limits. Yet here, the warmth continued without interruption. No bucket to refill. No stove to tend. No race against cooling water. Just abundance. Outside the shower building, the village moved through its ordinary afternoon. A delivery truck arrived at the relief center. Volunteers unloaded crates of supplies. Children chased each other across the square. Somewhere nearby, a carpenter sang softly while working on a damaged roof. Sergeant Walker spent most of the day helping organize inventory inside the warehouse. Around noon, he glanced toward the shower building and noticed the door remained closed. He smiled slightly and returned to work. An hour later he looked again. Still closed. Another volunteer noticed his expression. "Someone in there?" the man asked. Walker nodded. "A kid from town." The volunteer laughed. "Must be enjoying it." Walker looked toward the drifting steam above the roof. "I think he is remembering something." The volunteer seemed puzzled, but Walker offered no further explanation. Meanwhile, Hans stood once more beneath the stream. His eyes remained closed. Water ran through his hair and across his shoulders. The warmth no longer surprised him. Instead, it settled around him like an old friend returning after years away. Memories continued surfacing unexpectedly. A birthday cake with 13 candles seemed impossible now, yet he remembered a smaller one from long ago. He remembered sitting beside his father during a thunderstorm while rain tapped against windows. He remembered his mother singing while folding laundry. Tiny fragments. Ordinary fragments. The kind people rarely notice while living them. Yet those memories felt priceless now. For years, survival had pushed them into the background. The warmth seemed to bring them back. Eventually, a gentle knock sounded at the outer door. Hans opened his eyes. For a moment he simply listened. "Everything all right?" came Walker's voice from outside. There was no concern in the question. Only kindness. Hans looked around the room. Steam drifted toward the ceiling. Water continued falling. The tiles gleamed beneath the afternoon light. He realized he had completely lost track of time. "Yes," he called back. "Everything is fine." Walker chuckled softly from the other side of the door. "Good. Just checking." His footsteps faded away. Hans stood silently for another moment. Then he laughed too. A small laugh. A genuine one. Perhaps the first in a long while. The sound surprised him. It echoed gently off the walls and disappeared into the steam. Outside, the day slowly moved toward evening. Inside, the boy who had arrived carrying years of quiet heaviness felt something shifting within him. Nothing dramatic. Nothing sudden. Just a slow return of something precious. Hope. Not the loud kind. Not the kind spoken about in speeches. A quieter version. The kind that arrives through warm water, clean air, and a simple act of kindness. The kind that reminds a person that life can be more than endurance. The kind that reminds a 13-year-old boy that he still has a future waiting beyond the difficult years behind him. By the time Hans finally turned off the water, the afternoon sun had already begun its slow descent toward the horizon. The sudden silence felt strange. For hours, the steady sound of falling water had filled the room like a gentle piece of music. Now all he could hear was the faint ticking of cooling pipes and the distant murmur of life outside the building. He stood still for a moment, wrapped in warm air and drifting steam. He was not ready to leave. Yet he knew he eventually had to. Slowly, he dried his hair with the towel Walker had provided. The fabric felt soft against his skin. Another small luxury he had nearly forgotten existed. He dressed carefully, taking far more time than necessary. Every movement seemed reluctant, as if stepping back into the outside world would somehow end whatever had happened inside these walls. When he finally opened the door, late afternoon sunlight spilled across the yard. The brightness made him blink. The air outside felt cooler now, though summer still lingered in the village streets. Workers were finishing their tasks for the day. A truck rolled slowly toward the road. Someone stacked empty crates beside the warehouse. The ordinary world had continued while he remained hidden inside his quiet refuge. Near the loading area, Sergeant Walker was reviewing paperwork on a wooden table. He looked up as the door opened. For a second neither spoke. Hans noticed the American glance briefly toward the sky, then toward the shower building, as if calculating something in his head. A faint smile appeared. "You were in there quite a while," Walker said. There was no criticism in his voice. Only amusement. Hans looked down at the ground. "I guess so." Walker folded the papers and set them aside. "Do you know how long?" Hans shook his head. The American checked his wristwatch. "A little over 2 hours." Hans stared at him. 2 hours? Walker nodded. "Maybe a few minutes more." For a moment, Hans looked genuinely shocked. 2 hours felt impossible. He would have guessed 30 minutes. Perhaps 45. Certainly not 2 full hours. The realization made him laugh softly. Then something unexpected happened. The smile faded from his face. Not because he was unhappy. Because another emotion had quietly taken its place. Walker noticed it immediately. "What is it?" he asked. Hans searched for an answer. At first, none came. The feeling was difficult to describe. It sat somewhere deep inside him, beyond words. Finally, he looked toward the shower building one last time. Steam still drifted lazily from the vent above the roof, white against the blue afternoon sky. "For a while," he said quietly, "I forgot everything." Walker remained silent. Hans continued staring at the building. "I forgot about the cold." He paused. "I forgot about being worried all the time." Another pause followed. The sounds of the village seemed distant now. A dog barked somewhere down the road. A bicycle rattled over loose stones. Summer leaves rustled overhead. "I forgot there was a war," Hans finished softly. The words hung between them. Simple words. Honest words. Walker said nothing for several seconds. He understood that no response was necessary. Some truths were too important to interrupt. Eventually, he placed a hand on the edge of the table and nodded once. Not as a soldier. Not as an authority figure. Simply as one human being acknowledging another. Hans looked out across the village. The rooftops glowed amber beneath the lowering sun. Smoke rose from chimneys. Children ran through the square. Someone laughed in the distance. Everything looked familiar. Yet somehow different. The streets had not changed. The buildings had not changed. The world itself had not changed. But something inside him had. As he began the walk home, his steps felt lighter than they had that morning. And for the first time in years, the future waiting beyond the next day did not seem hidden behind uncertainty. It seemed visible. Like sunlight breaking through steam. The summer of 1945 slowly gave way to autumn. Leaves turned gold along the roads outside the village. The mornings arrived cooler. Smoke rose from chimneys earlier each day. Yet something about Hans had changed in a way everyone could see, even if few could explain it. He still helped his mother gather water. He still carried firewood. He still walked the same streets lined with repaired houses and unfinished projects. But the heaviness that once followed him everywhere seemed lighter now. He smiled more often. He spoke more freely. Sometimes he even joined the other children in the square when they played beneath the fading afternoon sun. Sergeant Walker noticed it too. Over the following weeks, Hans visited the relief center often. Sometimes to help unload supplies. Sometimes simply to say hello. The conversations between the boy and the American remained simple. Nothing dramatic. Nothing extraordinary. Yet both looked forward to them. One afternoon, while stacking boxes behind the warehouse, Walker asked what Hans wanted to do when he grew older. The boy paused for a moment. Months earlier he would not have had an answer. Back then, the future felt too distant to imagine. Now it felt different. "I think I want to build things," Hans said. Walker smiled. "What kind of things?" Hans looked toward the village well, toward the repaired buildings, toward the pipes that carried water into the shower building behind them. "Useful things," he replied. Years passed. The village continued rebuilding. Roads improved. Schools reopened. Families slowly found their footing again. Life moved forward the way it always does, one ordinary day at a time. Hans grew older. He studied hard. He developed a fascination with engineering, especially systems that brought clean water into homes and communities. What began as curiosity eventually became a career. Decades later, he helped design water infrastructure projects across towns and cities that needed them. His colleagues knew him as a thoughtful engineer. Reliable. Quiet. Dedicated. Few knew the reason behind his passion. Fewer still knew about a small shower building in a village recovering from hardship. One evening many years later, Hans attended a community event celebrating the completion of a new municipal water system. Children ran through sprinklers nearby. Families gathered beneath string lights. Water flowed freely from public fountains. Something most people barely noticed. Hans stood watching for a long time. A young reporter approached and asked a simple question. "What inspired you to spend your life working on water systems?" The older man smiled. His hair was gray now. His hands carried the marks of decades spent building and designing. For a moment, he looked beyond the crowd. Beyond the celebration. Beyond the present. Back to a summer afternoon long ago. Back to drifting steam. Back to warm water falling from a shower head while sunlight filtered through high windows. "When I was 13, he said quietly, "someone showed me that comfort is not a luxury. Sometimes it is hope." The reporter waited for more. Hans looked toward the children laughing near the fountain. "People think changing a life requires something grand," he continued. "Sometimes it is much smaller than that." Water splashed against concrete. Evening light reflected from the surface like liquid gold. "Sometimes it is simply giving someone a reason to believe tomorrow can be better than yesterday." As the sun sank below the horizon, Hans remained standing there for a while, listening to the sound of running water. The same sound that had once echoed through a quiet room filled with steam. The same sound that had reminded a frightened boy what normal life felt like. The same sound that had quietly returned a piece of childhood he thought was gone forever. The years had carried him far from that village and far from that summer day. Yet he never forgot what happened there. Because in the end, it was never really about hot water. It was about dignity. It was about kindness. It was about a simple act that asked for nothing in return. And whenever Hans remembered that afternoon, he remembered one truth above all others. The difficult years had taken many things from the boy he once was. But for a few quiet hours, warmth gave one of them back.